United Nations Human Rights Council ends Yemen war crimes probe amid controversy. Houthi rebels' ongoing military escalation causes new waves of displaced people nationwide. Houthi rebels bomb civilian areas in Hodeidah, violating Stockholm Agreement. Welcome to Yemen Today TV. This is the English news with me, Rana Swalam. In Geneva, Human Rights Council voted for rejecting mandate of extending mission of group of eminent experts in Yemen. The main task of this committee was to probe war crimes and atrocities committed by the warring parties. 21 member states voted against renewing the United Nations Human Rights Council's mandate to investigate war crimes in Yemen yesterday. More details of the impact of such resolution is within this report.
18 in favour, 21 against, and 7 abstentions. Draft proposal L11 is therefore rejected.
Members of the United Nations Human Rights Council on Thursday narrowly blocked the mandate to continue independent investigations into alleged war crimes during the ongoing Yemen conflict. In a tight 21-18 vote, diplomats put an end to Dutch plans for a 2-year extension to an independent investigation despite Western support. Bahrain, Russia and Pakistan led 21 countries who voted against Dutch resolution for a 2-year extension of the investigation, with Germany, the UK and France heading 18 countries that voted in favour. There were 7 abstentions and Ukraine was absent for the meeting. The camp who voted for ending the mission of the team accuses investigators of misinformation about the war inside Yemen. However, the camp who voted in favour of extending the mandate has been angered by the vote, which some said was instigated by a strong Arab lobby against the UN resolution. I cannot help but feel that this council has failed the people of Yemen, said Dutch Ambassador Peter Becker after the vote. Independent investigators said both warring parties committed war crimes and broke international human rights law. Yemen's decades of tensions and violence escalated into full-scale civil war in late 2014 when Houthi rebels took control of Sana'a. Shortly after, the rebels also seized the presidential palace, leading to the government's resignation. The coalition intervened in the conflict at the ousted government's request in March 2015, despite the UN-led efforts to establish peaceful political transition were ongoing. Around 2/3 of people have been affected by the Yemen civil war, according to the UN. This committee of experts has been controversial since day one. Many local parties were not happy and some regional forces thought it was not neutral. In the end, Yemenis look for anything that could stop the war and end the suffering.
A UN report revealed that more than 6 million Yemeni women are in dire need of protection due to violence and deprivation resulting from war. The United Nations Office for Humanitarian Affairs stated that 7 years of conflict have significantly increased vulnerability of women and girls to violence and abuse. The International Organization for Migration announced that about 10,000 people were displaced last September due to Houthi escalation in the city. The organization indicated that it monitored the displacement of about 10,000 people and that there has been an alarming increase in displacement rates since September due to fighting in and around Ma'rib. Internally displaced people's suffering aggravates day by day as the conflict extends to new areas in the country. Despite the UN efforts to alleviate their pain and war calamities, many of them still lack the basics of life. The following report has more on this story.
The Houthi militia prevented the displacement of hundreds of families from Al Juba district south of Ma'rib, where confrontations are taking place with government forces. The Executive Unit for the Management of IDP Camps directed a distress call to the United Nations and human rights organizations to take a serious stance towards the unarmed civilians in the districts of Ain, Bayhan, Usaylan, and Harib on the outskirts of Shabwa and Ma'rib, with the new wave of displacement caused by the militia opening a new front to fight there. The Executive Unit of Ma'rib said that a wave of displacement coming from the district as a result of the barbaric attack by the terrorist Houthi militia. It continues due to the continuation of the Houthi military escalation in the area and warned that this will lead to a large wave of displacement and multiply the suffering of civilians. The recent armed confrontations between the Yemeni government forces and the Houthi militia over the control of key areas in Al-Baida displaced up to 1,535 families. The ongoing fighting forced the families to flee their houses in Al-Baida areas and seek for other safer places in the government-controlled southern province of Lahj. The Iranian-backed Houthi militia recently intensified their military operations against the government-controlled areas in different parts of the war-ravaged Arab country and succeeded in capturing key areas from the government forces that withdrew from their sites in Al-Baida and other cities in Yemen. According to what the unit said, the Houthi militia imposed a tight siege which is inhabited by more than 35,000 people and prevented the arrival of food and medicine supplies for the fourth consecutive day, which requires urgent UN intervention to lift that siege.
In Ma'rib, students of Sabah University condemned Houthi rebels' repeated attacks against civilian areas in the city. Such attacks have killed tens of children and women. In a solidarity rally, protesters called upon the international community to act immediately to stop Houthi barbaric acts against civilians and demanded lifting of siege on Al-Abdiyah, which has been imposed on the area for 2 weeks now. Turning to Hodeidah, Houthi militia is shelled civilian areas into Haita. Local sources reported that the Houthi militia bombarded residential areas with heavy mortar shells. This repeated bombing created a state of fear and panic among people, especially children and women. The Joint Forces engineering team discovered a Houthi mine plant after an incident of mine explosion injured a woman east of the city. According to sources, the team surveyed an area estimated at more than 300 square meters between the Red Sea Mills and Al-Masna village. In Al-Dala, Houthi rebels launched intensive shelling with heavy weapons on populated areas northwest of the city. According to local sources, the rebels targeted with heavy machine gun populated villages in Al-Qatawa. Since Houthi rebels have controlled Sana'a, they have committed all kinds of human rights violations. Political opponents, journalists, women, and even children all have been victims of the rebels' deadly acts. The following report has more on that story.
The Yemeni people have been going through a difficult time since the start of the war. The Houthis continue violating human rights in Yemen, and they keep letting people go through hell. The year 2020 recorded a significant increase in civil, political, social, and economic human rights violations in Yemen, and many civilian victims were killed, injured, and arrested. The National Committee for Investigation of Allegations of Human Rights Violations monitored 2,901 incidents of violations that happened in various Yemeni governorates, affecting 4,292 victims of both men and women, and of different ages, including 1,363 dead and wounded as a result of targeting civilians, including 404 dead, 56 women, and 83 children, and 751 wounded, including 103 women and 194 children. The committee is investigating allegations of human rights violations in Yemen by monitoring the cases it receives through its field teams in light of the continuation of the war, which claimed the lives of thousands of Yemenis dead and wounded, and affected human rights and the humanitarian situation in all fields, which led to a high rate of poverty in all governorates, and the continuation of mass displacement from war zones that affected civilians and their right to security, food, medicine, health, education, freedom of movement, and other rights. The Commission affirmed its continuation to investigate human rights violations, as it has pursued it since the beginning of its work, in accordance with the international standards enforced by the Commissions of Inquiry, calling on all parties to comply with international humanitarian law and international human rights law, especially the obligation to protect the life, safety, and dignity of civilians without discrimination, and ensuring their access to resources and opportunities for a decent living. It's noteworthy that the Yemeni government documented last March 21,000 violations committed by the Houthi militia in Sana'a, including killing and torture to death, enforced disappearance, looting of funds, displacement, child abuse, violations against women, aid looting, and depriving children from education, while continuing to impede relief work, seizing relief materials, and closing the offices of human rights organizations. Yemeni people are suffering in all aspects. The international community is aware of the Yemeni situation, yet no actions are being taken to elevate the suffering that has been going for more than 9 years now. The people just want a normal life and to be heard.
Coming next. Torrential rains caused gross damage in Hadramaut due to Shaheen cyclone.
أقول لك راحت بالغداء لأهلها شلت الغداء وراحت بأهلها في المزرعة، والمزرعة ركبت على حمار ما حتى نص المزرعة وانفجر فيها اللغم، دعست على اللغم وانفجر فيهم. الحمار انتهى ما أدرها وتبقعت رجليها كامل. نغير منها نغير الشبعلة اللي هي البيت سابحة من دور رجليها، لما صافناها طبية أقرب طبية وصافناها لا هي بطلت رجليها كامل.
قلت أزود هلي وقابل لي لعام وطبعت تحت الزوايا.
Welcome back. In Aden, heavy torrential rains fell on the city as part of the effects of Shaheen cyclone that struck Oman a few days ago. Major areas in Aden were affected by the rains. Meanwhile, the governor of Aden directed authorities to raise the level of alert to face consequences of this torrential rains. The Minister of Public Health and Population, Dr. Qasim Buhaybih, gave orders to raise alert in hospitals, health offices, and emergency teams to face any emergency due to the country's exposure to strong winds and thunderstorms as indirect effects of Shaheen cyclone. He gave directions that ambulances to be spread on public roads and that hospitals to be equipped with the necessary medical supplies to undermine risks. Mukalla and Hadramaut experienced difficult nights due to heavy and moderate rains for the second day due to Shaheen cyclone. Floods engulfed large parts of the city, causing great losses in public and private properties. This report has more on the story.
Hadramaut Governorate witnessed heavy rains due to Shaheen cyclone that hit the region. Rains caused gross and severe damages to Mukalla. Torrential floods swept everything that was on its way.
Yesterday, we were surprised by heavy rain. The floods destroyed personal and public property. Cars are the most damaged by the rain. We demand local authority to compensate those affected and remove flood remnants from streets so that the city can return to what it was before.
Mukalla was isolated from life. Streets were empty and filled with floods. The infrastructure was heavily damaged. Most of private and public properties, such as cars, especially in this area, were washed away.
What about the governor? What about local authority? Yesterday, civilians were rescuing people who were drowning. There are people who were severely affected in Al-Ghawazi and Addis. Yesterday, we rescued a pregnant woman who was going to give birth and our car broke down due to the torrential rains.
Torrential rains and floods had great repercussions on citizens' properties. A complete indifference from local authorities and response teams. Immediate actions should be taken to avoid more damages, especially in terms of human loss as a result of such floods.
Living conditions have greatly deteriorated since the rebels seized power in 2014. Salaries haven't been paid and the national currency dropped hugely. All this has overshadowed people's lives and made it hard for them to cope. The following report has more on this story.
A lot of water ran in the river of Yemen since the Houthi rebels captured the capital Sana'a on the 21st of September 2014. Back then, they entered the capital and controlled government institutions in a silent moment in the history of Yemen. Since that moment, the country entered a new vicious circle of violence and collapse. On the political side, the country is divided between a government that steers the wheel from outside, led by President Abdurrabbu Mansour Hadi, and the Houthi rebels who control parts of the country in the northwest, in addition to the capital. Peace in Yemen knows nowhere, with fighting flares in every front, between the resistance in the Red Sea coast and the rebels. Fighting between the rebels too and the government forces is flaring in Ma'rib and other areas in the north and south of the country. The Houthi rebels try to penetrate the lines of the government forces in Ma'rib to control a vital location in the country that will give them semi-full control. They violate the Stockholm Accord in Hodeidah by their infiltration attempts and their daily shelling of civilians. The political chaos, the indecisive military solution, the involvement of foreign actors, and the inaction of the international community all nurture the continuation of conflict. The Houthis, for their part, looks for the Imami ruling. They force Yemenis to retreat back to the past days of the last century, before the revolution. For that end, they control the Yemeni livelihoods or drive them to a standstill. The rebels even are controlling the flow of humanitarian aid that is donated to Yemeni people from outside to feed around 20 million who are on the brink of famine. Corruption and illicit gains out of humanitarian aid is on the rise. Reports say that the economy of war drove a number of Yemenis to hoard lots of money allocated in essence to the poor. According to reports, Houthis amassed no lesser than 1.8 billion of state's finances to fund their war for control. Sources in the capital reveal that Houthis are behind the disruption in the foreign exchange rate after they controlled the government finances, which drove inflation in the country to rising digits. This fact could be added to the fake banknotes, the differentiation in the rate of the local currency, and the continued money washing and arms purchase. The one who suffers out of all that is the Yemeni poor citizen who is swinging between the parties and who doesn't have basic needs that makes him able to continue a human life. In the end, after 7 years of Houthi rebellious control of the capital Sana'a, the country had the worst humanitarian crisis in the world.
The National Committee Against Coronavirus announced 34 new cases of the COVID-19 in 6 governorates. Committee officials said on Twitter that 12 cases were recorded in Al-Mahra, 11 in Adan, 5 in Hadramaut, 3 in Shabwa, 2 in Taiz, 1 in Al-Dala. Also, 8 deaths were recorded, plus 36 recovered cases. With the current updates, the total confirmed cases are 9,333, including 1,773 deaths and 5,901 cases of recovery. Here's a reminder of the main headlines. United Nations Human Rights Council ends Yemen war crimes probe amid controversy. Houthi rebels' ongoing military escalation causes new waves of displaced people nationwide. Houthi rebels bomb civilian areas in Hodeidah, violating Stockholm Agreement. This is the end of the news. Thank you for watching. Have a great day.